Hi everyone, this is Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network. This is my second part to thematic play in my positional mini-series, and every week I'll try to upload a video onto my YouTube channel, Chess Summit. So, for today's video, I wanted to continue my discussion on thematic play, and in the first scheme that we went over, I didn't really do a good job of putting my pieces in the right places to have ideal plans. So this game I played 2 rounds later, and it was essentially the same opening. There's a couple move order differences, but I did a much better job of putting my pieces in the right place to carry out the same plan throughout the opening, and I find that this approach is definitely more effective, and so I wanted to share this game with you. So, we start out with a Najdorf Sicilian. So far it's like the game that we showed in part 1. My opponent plays bishop e2, but he can always transpose with f3. I knew this going into the game, so I just continued with my standard approach. e5, kicking the knight to b3. So in this position, I need to identify my goals. Well, so far I already know that I have a backwards pawn on d6, so, if I can ever achieve it, I want to push this pawn to d5. If I can push this pawn to d5 and trade off these pawns, I won't have this weakness on d6, and I'll have an active dark squared bishop. So my goal needs to be pushing this d5 pawn. This was something I failed to do in part 1 that I was able to achieve in this game. I played bishop e7 to prepare castling. My opponent played bishop g5, which changed my plans a little bit. I think this bishop move was actually a little bit misplaced. The bishop really needed to be on e3, and the reason why it doesn't really belong on g5 is he doesn't want to trade and give me the bishop pair immediately in the opening. Secondly, I can always play h6 and kick this bishop, meaning that he wasted a move to put it on g5, and it's going to be harder with him with a pawn on h6 to have this g5 push. So there's no real plan with bishop g5. That being said, I don't want to play h6 yet. I want to see what white does. If he plays like a move like queen d2 to like make this battery, if you want to call it that, stronger, or to support this bishop here, then I want to play h6, because then he's wasted 2 moves to make this move. So I just continued to develop normally with knight bd7. So knight bd7, he played queen d2, and now I played h6. So in this position, I'm already ready to defend against any threats of this g-pawn coming to g5. So right now I just want to focus on development. I don't want to castle yet because I don't know how strong this attack is going to be or how white is going to play this pawn structure. If he goes for like an f4 idea, I can probably castle and be okay for the most part. But if he goes for the standard Yugoslav f3, g4, h4, then it's a little bit of a different story. So what's my plan? Right now it looks like I'm a little bit cramped, so I need to create space so I can play this d5 move. Notice how right now I only have 1 piece protecting d5, whereas white has 1, 2, 3. And if he queenside castles, I'll make it 4. So how am I going to arrange my pieces so I can play d5? Well, this knight's in the way, so this knight definitely wants to be on a better square to prepare d5, so ideally it goes to b6. This bishop can either go to e6 or b7 to support d5, and ideally the queen is not on the d-file, the rook is. The rook will be on d8 and the queen will be on c7, so that way the rook, it's stronger with the queen on the same file. So by doing that, by having played b5, knight b6, bishop b7, and having the rook on d8, that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4 defenders of d5. That'll be more than enough to support this move. So here I played queen c7. This is a much more solid move than when I had played queen a5 in the game. Obviously the knight hadn't been to b3 yet, but the queen actually does more from c7, because when he queenside castles, the queen will be on the same file as the king, and when I play rook d8, my rook will be on the same file as the queen. My opponent plays f3 as expected. Here I didn't really find anything to worry about, so I just continued with my play. I played b5. And then my opponent made a little bit of a dubious move here. He played a3. I guess he was worried about the threat of b4. But in this position, if I play b4 and he plays knight b1, yes, the knight is misplaced, and yes, he's wasted a move, but this pawn is now hyperextended. Playing a5 won't exactly help my position. He can always play like a4 to try to undermine my position. And this isn't really strong for me. Also, if I have to play a5 to support a pawn on b4, that opens up these light squares for his bishop, which is generally a bad bishop in this opening. So, my thematic play is not to play b4, it's to play d5. So by playing a3, he's actually creating a weakness for the future, perhaps, if he castles queenside. So I just played bishop b7. I'm continuing with my plan. Everything is about pushing d5. My opponent plays g4. Here I had to think for a second just to make sure that there was no attack. But I can calculate, well, if I play rook d8, my opponent plays h4, and I play knight b6. If he pushes g5, takes, the rook is hanging. So white's attack is missing something right now, so I'm more than willing to continue with my play towards pushing d5. If I can push d5 and trade off these two pawns, this f3 pawn will be weak enough that this attack should fall apart relatively easily. So my opponent made a mistake here. He played g5. I guess his idea was to open up make the g file a half-open g file, so that way if I castle kingside, I'm definitely weak. But the critical word here is if. Of course, if I castle kingside, white is better. But if I keep my king on e8, and I just play off the h file, my rook has a half-open h file. Furthermore, by trading off on g5, I have a short-term advantage in that I can play knight b6, preparing d5 without having to worry about bishop takes b6. So in this position, I'm perfectly happy. My opponent queenside castles. So in this position, I look at all my options, but if you look at all the moves I've been making, knight f6, knight d7 to b6, bishop b7, queen c7, rook d8, it's all been about playing d5. Can I play d5? Yes. I played d5, he took. I played knight on b takes. I played knight on b takes because if the bishop comes back to e3 and attacks b6, I don't want to have to calculate lines where he can take on b6. Also, I figured that the knight on b6 was the least optimized piece, so by putting it in the center, at least it's a stronger piece now. My opponent took, and here I had the choice really between rook takes and bishop takes. I didn't want to consider knight takes because then I have to calculate all of the lines with bishop takes e7. But here I decided that bishop takes d5 is the most forcing move because it threatens bishop takes knight. Which can cause a real problem for my opponent. My opponent played queen e3, so it's the only piece protecting the knight. And so in this position, I've completed my d5 plan. My pieces are in good squares. So it's just a matter of how do I execute the attack. Well, generally you want all of your pieces in the game. This knight on f6 is doing a good job. This bishop on e7 really needs to be here, so that way the queen's it's not as strong on this file with the king. But queen's doing a good job on c7. My bishop on d5 is really effective, and my rook on d8 is activated. So the only piece that hasn't been activated is my rook on h5. Rook on h8, so I play rook h8 to h5, threatening the bishop. Notice how if I take the knight, queen takes bishop, rook takes bishop, and I am materially better by a minor piece. So my opponent needs to respond to this threat, so he played king b1. So I've activated all my pieces. Now it's just a matter of how do I make my pieces better. Well, I don't have the threat really of bishop takes knight just yet, but I can make my pieces better. This bishop still needs to be here, but this rook on d8 is contesting with this d1 rook, so I decided to shift it over one square, so it's more effective attacking c2. So my opponent here played rook d2, with the idea of making a battery, I guess, with rook on h to d1, and this is a tactical mistake, so I'll stop for a quick second here and try to let you guys figure it out. How does black take advantage of this mistake? Okay, well, if you haven't solved it yet, you should stop the video because this is a critical tactical idea here. I played bishop takes b3 with the idea of removing the defender. So if queen takes, rook takes bishop, right? So that means white's only option is to play c takes b3. But the queen is the only piece protecting the bishop. How do I attack the queen so it can't protect the bishop? Well, if I can attack the queen at all, I know it can't go to f4. And if I attack the queen, if it stays on where it's at, I'm just going to take the queen, assuming that the way I attack it's a good move. So bishop c5 is relatively easy to find. So there's no queen takes e5 check, there's no queen f4, so this bishop is lost. So my opponent played rook c2. I took on e3. He took on c7. Takes, takes, takes. And so in this position, I'm materially better, but I haven't won just yet. I need to activate my pieces furthermore. Notice how thematic play doesn't just stop with the opening. You really want to continue with your optimizing ideas in the middle game. So here, my opponent has a pair of bishops, so I do need to be careful, but I do have this really nice move, rook h3. The idea is if he moves the h rook, I can take on h2. If he moves the e2 bishop, I can take on f3. And if he plays f4 to trade these pawns, I'm going to take the bishop on e3. So that really only leaves him with one piece to move. So he plays bishop b6, rook c6, bishop a5. And so here my opponent really is yet to find a way to activate these pieces, so I just decided to activate mine. I play knight h5. The idea is to play knight g3 or knight to f4. My opponent saw this and decided to be a little bit tricky. He played bishop d3 with the idea that I play rook f3, he's going to play bishop e4, forking my rooks, and it's going to be a game again. And so, in these kinds of positions, it's critical not to move immediately and take these pawns because your opponent wants you to fall for these traps. Secondly, though, even if he doesn't have this fork, let's say bishop e4 is illegal for some reason, after rook takes f3, he still has bishop e2, and that still makes the position fairly complicated. And, if your opponent can make the position more complicated, you should try to avoid those lines and stay where it's just relatively simple. So rather than going for the pawn, I just put my rook on a better square on d6. Bishop c2, rook h6. Notice how I'm slowly making my pieces stronger, where white has really failed to do anything productive. My opponent played rook e1, hanging the h2 pawn, but here I don't want to play rook takes h2, because then he gets to optimize his rook with rook takes e5 check. Now I could be in trouble. So I played f6. My opponent played bishop to d2, and I played g5. Now my opponent doesn't really have any more forcing moves, and he has two hanging pawns. Notice how because these pawns were so weak, I didn't need to take them immediately. I knew that they were going to be weaknesses long term. My opponent played bishop to e4, and I just decided to take on h2. My opponent played bishop b4, and I just played knight g3. Notice how everything so far has just been about making my pieces better. So bishop c6, king f7, bishop d5, king g6, and my opponent played king a2 to avoid rook h1, trading the rooks and winning the game. However, he leaves himself open to a really nice tactic here. I'm going to stop for a second to see if maybe you guys can solve it. Okay, well, if you haven't solved it yet, this is a pretty cool idea. So when you're assessing this position, trying to figure out how to win, you're not going to have a pass pawn, immediately, but you can take advantage over a couple of things. These bishops are misplaced, and this king is very weak. If you could perhaps get two rooks, and one of them's on a1 and the other one's on the first rank, that's checkmate. His bishop can't move out of the way immediately to play b4. Well, it can, but he has to make two moves to play b4, so he has an escape square. So the first thing I looked at when I was in this position was I looked, how can I attack this king? And so I knew that rook trades were good for me, so I went with rook h1, getting a free move with a free rook on the first rank. My opponent played rook e3, and then here I need to decide how am I going to get this rook off the h1 square so this rook can get to h1. So I look for the most forcing move, and rook d1 attacks the bishop. My opponent played bishop c6, and then I found rook on h to h1, threatening rook a1 checkmate, and there's nothing my opponent can do. Bishop e4 check, knight takes e4, there's no follow-up. Bishop e8, I just move my king to like g7, and again there's no follow-up. Bishop f8's just met with king takes f8, so all those are computer moves, and rook a1 is unstoppable. If he plays rook e1, I just take, and I'm up a whole rook. So by having more active pieces, I was able to play a much more effective game than that first game. So if you learned anything from this video, I hope that you understand that thematic play is very important. Thematic play and optimization go hand in hand because optimization means putting your pieces on the best places possible, so in that way they can do something later in the middle game. Thematic play is the strategic idea of what you do in the middle game. So when you study your openings, you should always look for, what are grandmasters doing? What patterns are they always following? And I knew, after losing the game that I showed in part 1 that finding this idea with d5 is really critical. And, I based my entire game around it this round, and I had a much better result. Thank you for watching. This is Isaac Steincamp signing off for the Chess Summit Network.